Hello, everyone. Welcome to Miami Beach Urban Studios. My name is Colette Mello, and I'm in conversation today with Jose L. Garcia. Thank you for joining us. FIU Miami Beach Urban Studios is known for communication, architecture, and the arts. I'd like to thank Miami Beach Department of Tourism and Office of Cultural Affairs for sponsoring these art talks. Jose Luis Garcia is a Miami-based artist who works in photography and printmaking. His intimate works have an ephemeral quality that is informed by memory, time, and identity. His work has been exhibited here at Miami Beach Urban Studios, at Vizcaya, the Bakehouse Art Complex, and FIU Frost Art Museum. He was recently chosen to participate in the 2020 Florida Biennial at the Hollywood Art and Cultural Center, which is scheduled to open in early November. Jose has a BFA from the New World School of Arts and an MFA degree from Florida International University. And he also teaches at Miami-Dade College. Before I hand it over to Jose, I'd like to remind everyone that if you have any comments or questions, to please put them in the chat function. Thank you, Jose. Hi, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Colette. Thank you so much for having me. I just realized I'm not sure if the screen is already being shared or if I was already a hiccup in my...
That's fine. That's great.
Awesome. So first of all, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Colette, for having me, especially to talk on behalf of MBUS, which was one of the more fruitful and important experiences in my graduate experience, or as my experience as a graduate student at FIU. Like Colette mentioned, I received my Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Photography and Printmaking from New World School of the Arts, and I received my MFA in Studio Art over at FIU. So I'm gonna start just showing a different excerpt selection of my work, but I have a lot of behind the scenes or documentation photos from my time at MBUS or with MBUS.
First, I want to ask you, where are you?
Oh, so I'm zooming in from my studio at home in Hialeah, Florida.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm here.
And that's where you've been working since the pandemic started? That's your studio space that you've been working in?
Correct. Yeah, since even before the pandemic, ever since I finished my graduate studies, I haven't been allotted kind of a studio space or a reasonably priced studio space. So I've been working from home, and I've just carved out some space, starting with a table, like, you know, many struggling artists, to now having a space which is actually workable, and now also my classroom in my role as a teacher.
Of course. Yep. I remember visiting your studio when you were at FIU. You had a great studio there, but that looks really nice too. So
Thank you. Yeah, I like to think a studio is, as much as the equipment and the space is, you know, a part of the studio, right? The mindset is your ultimate studio, right? So whether it's this nice white cube that some people are fond of, or a table, or just a sketchbook, you know, studio is what you make of it.
wonderful.
So to start off, a lot of people that approach my practice always ask how I fit in terms of photography or as a photographer. In my earliest work, or in my early work at New World, even before New World as a high school photographer, I was working with traditional photography, black and white film, photographing what we would call kind of straight photography. And my work in itself kind of took a detour, kind of transformed into something else. But I love to start off, especially in conversations like the one we have today, Colette, showing some work that might not be within someone's periphery of what I've been doing. So we think of the home as this space so important now that we're in the confines of our home. But my earliest work was exploring that, and I would say like 2010 or so, where I was photographing all at home, even when there was no requirement or mandate. So looking at furniture, different structures, working within the kind of field of photography, black and white, in color, digital, and kind of expanding my practice on a technical way. And it wasn't until I was closing out my chapter at New World where my work manifested into something else, This was actually from the thesis exhibition where I explored family photographs in the home. So the family archive as the source of my work, rather than going out and depicting my surroundings, like maybe the photographs before, although obscure. I was really chronicling my family history, my lineage, my connection to family members, and a majority of the time, that connection being through photography. You know,
So when you
thinking,
were growing
Mhm.
up, were you always taking images, or were you always with the camera, or when did you start thinking of yourself as an artist?
I think I could confidently say I was an artist when one of the people here, he's already smiling. When I was in high school, where I think being a high school student and taking an interest in art, it isn't enough to really solidify your presence or identity as an artist. But Tom Virgin, who's here, kind of always emphasized for a group of us where, no, you're an artist where you are right now. You don't have to wait, just continue that. And so I think it was probably senior year in high school when I learned to develop film that I just had an aha moment where, I enjoyed drawing, I enjoyed painting too. Not really, I didn't enjoy painting, but I enjoyed drawing and some of the different art makings, but really when I fit into photography is when it all made sense to me. Even understanding like Warhol and how he worked throughout printmaking, it was when I felt like, okay, not only do I understand on the emotional level that I'm an artist, but now that there's a medium that my obsessions can kind of run rampant. So this was around that same time where I was again documenting the inside of my home, the person who I live with, the person I was raised by, which is my grandmother, and kind of dealing within my work this duality of showing, bearing myself on an intimate level, but also the ambiguity of it all, the secrecy that could at times be attributed to how a Cuban household may operate, the facade, things we don't talk about, but also exploring different elements of my own identity and, what gender norms or notions of gender. A term that people would kind of box me into was that my work was effeminate, which I never quite understood other than the kind of usual way people describe effeminate work, like this derogatory, like small, pretty, quiet work. But it was really in that I found out that that was the power or strength that already my work was subverting some sort of gender norm of what I was expected to make as a male photographer. And so that's where I really began to think of that, the colors that we might associate with gender and the relationships. And so while I was looking at these different photographs in my home, that oftentimes the relationships with the subjects were simply through photographs. They had deceased since a certain point, and how that both made their memory live on and glorify their presence, but at the same time, it also obscured their presence. What is the reality? Is this photograph, this moment recorded in time, or in the opposite side of the spectrum, a piece of paper that is lying that we're holding on and projecting onto? So thinking of that, of kind of memory as then this thing that I explored. This work I started making when I transitioned to FIU, where I almost abandoned a camera for a significant amount of time and started using things like photocopy machines and using the actual photographs in my home as the subject, as the approach. And in this series, it's a photograph copied almost performatively in a durational piece where after X amount of prints, the photograph stops to depict the person. But almost like any like philosophical concern, do we say that the person loses their identity the minute the photograph is taken, or the minute we can't recollect their eye, their nose, their mouth?
Did you take this photograph, or this was an image that you had already had available to you?
So this is an image from the 1980s from my family's kind of archive. So a majority of the work, pretty much from this point on, is photographs not taken by me. So seeing, in this particular image, seeing the eyes of this young woman, this young person, but I was not the one who was there at that moment. So similar to the image beforehand, where this kind of looking is where I play in, or where my role is. I'm not the photographer. I'm the person looking. I'm the person longing. I'm the person recollecting, remembering, forgetting. So these next couple of works were with the same idea, looking into the archive. These photographs actually come from photos of my father when he was a young boy, and our identities and how they kind of intersect or relate. You know, my dad is, for the most part, the kind of stereotypical Cuban man. He's a carpenter by trade, just like my grandfather, and he exemplifies all of what some would call, these masculine traits. And I was the exact opposite, kind of effeminate. So these prints and these photographs became something else. They became monoprints. So one off, well, printmakers consider a ghost print, like the remnants of the process. And so this was almost like an embedding of his childhood, my childhood, because we're in hand raised by the same person. So all these kind of like parallels and dualities, and at times intersecting and at times completely different. So this photograph actually depicts me and my younger cousin. And this was in a point where I was really pushing the materiality of the photograph. So thinking a photograph stops being a photo the minute it's not printed on nice paper, the minute a camera's not used, the minute, I don't know, the minute it stops existing. So for this particular piece, it became a projection. So even more pushing this ephemerality, that it's on display for a certain moment of time and then the light bulb goes out, almost like Felix Gonzalez Torres, who's probably the my biggest influence in terms of like the poetics and even identity as a queer artist.
Well, I thought of him when I saw the work of with the photocopies that you did, because he does that a lot, where he's making copies and copies of works at museum, asking people to take one. Um, Very nice. And I read that you're very interested in the passage of time in your work, and I definitely see that. And I think that's a really hard quality to capture. Like, what does time look like? But I think you've done a really good job on what it does look like.
Definitely. I mean, even culturally, with the advancement of technology, there becomes all of this embedded history and information. You know, the photograph we saw earlier of a sepia toned image, that quality is so much different than a cell phone camera, a digital image, even if we think of the styling. So I think there are elements, whether it's specific to a point in time or in the one that's up right now, where there is no, at least photographic tangibility that we can mark and say this existed in 2003 or 1990 or the 80s, or when did this exist. And I think to some degree it's because of the process. These were created and they're part of a series called Bleed, where a lot of different photos in the my family archive, specific moments in time, like this being kind of the first day of 1 year of school. I believe it's like second grade, but the mark of this image was it was this kind of rite of passage of also understanding my otherness, my identity as separate from most of the boys. Coming from living quite literally in a pink house at one point, which I love now. But in this particular image, it was when my head was shaved, almost like this imposed like masculinity. Before that, I had that kind of cute mushroom haircut many boys in the early 90s had. But I think there's all these deeper meta narratives, which for me are the driving point and perhaps add layers to the work. But Colette, like you mentioned, sometimes it is deeply personal, yet somehow, regardless of even anyone's history or story, they start to reflect or think about the imagery that they're accustomed to or that they've lived with. And I think that's what excites me most about displaying my work. It's not necessarily giving my autobiography, which I honestly think is one of the more uncomfortable parts of being an artist or making this kind of intimate work. But I just love that branching out. This one I
As
saw
an
earlier.
artist, do you think as an artist, since you brought it up, do you think it's important for the viewer to know the biography of the artist when they're looking at artwork, or is it you don't think it's important?
Oh, I think it's important. I think just with this kind of work, when we talk about memory as this monolithic thing, where
Mhm.
it can't just be about your memory, or to say that everyone's memory is related, because there's so much in terms of gender and sexuality, race, where I'm telling a very specific story or point of view, which is my own. Um, and so I think that alludes and it shows in some ways, and it adds a context to the work. But I think to do justice to, memory or associations with memory, it's also freeing it from your own memory, almost like vernacular
Right.
photography.
Do you think, as a curator, are you opposed to labels? Do you like labels on your work, or no? Do you title all your works?
I typically title, if they're almost like this past series that we're seeing, they're all part of a portfolio together. So they all have a title as one piece, which is Bleed. And
Mhm.
these photos are actually, or these prints are prints that were left in water and the ink starts to kind of bleed out and become rephotographed. So that's also like a symbol, the rephotographing of things. In terms of label, you see that in the slideshow, there are no labels. So I think that speaks into where I stand, but I think they are important, at least to refer to add some more context, just like curatorial statements, which I think are probably the label that I'm more, that I champion more of, which is someone is in conversation, someone is interpreting the work so that it meets a criteria, whether it's the exhibition or the space. But I don't like being kind of declarative or authoritative with my work. Like, it's a collaboration. So if the curator really needs labels and that's important in their practice, I welcome that. And I think in a kind of vagueness, like words or two or a phrase. I'm not sure if that was too long-winded,
No,
but
I like that. I like you're talking about the collaboration, because I think that too, and I know some artists don't. They are very specific about what they want the world to see. So I was just interested in your idea on that.
yeah, I think ultimately it depends on the message, right? If there's a specific message that needs to come across and is important to the work, then, let's print that out and put all the vinyl everywhere. But I think with work like this, I'm interested in that projection. What happens when you move through a space, whether it's emotional, whether it ties into your history, or just projecting narratives, which I think adds something to the work too. Trying to make sense of who these people are without any context, which kind of mirrors what maybe my early adolescence was like, looking at these people like, who's this, who's that. And the spirit of collaboration was one of my exhibitions at MBUS with Balaxis Bui, who's a curator, photographer, artist, performance artist, theorist, dancer. Balaxis does it all. And in this exhibition, we worked together to come up with ways to put up the work and display them, but really thinking of MBUS as the space where we are within an institution, within the white cube or this space, but we also have the opportunity to maybe use objects and display works in non-traditional ways. In this particular exhibition, we paired it with objects from the home. Some of the objects, like these flowers, were from Belaxis's home, and other times it was objects from my actual home. So some frames, some actual furniture. And so we had these photographs suspended, printed, and hung with magnets, um, unframed, which is something that I often show my work in. These are digital prints. Like I mentioned, they sometimes are projection, but a lot of times the actual surface of the photograph is important. Unfortunately, these are kind of straight out of the printer. But we
So
also brought in things like dirt too. What was that, Colette?
I say, working with Biloxi, I know her. She is very talented, very creative. I know she does gestures. So is some of this are the gestures that she put into the work, like you said, the flowers. So that she's
Definitely,
very
yes.
collaborative in her practice. Yeah, she likes. Okay. And how about the dirt? You were getting ready to mention the dirt.
Yeah, so the dirt was again one of those kind of curatorial gestures. And what I liked about working with Balaxis is, in essence, it's a two-person show, kind of reacting to the work and adding these elements as at times part of the design, the height and placement, but really then thinking of as a curator, Balaxis is really interested um, in really these objects and tying them together. So dirt, flowers, decaying flowers became this. And I liked it because it was almost like this middle ground between my memory, her memory, and this remnant. Around the same time when the Balaxis brought in dirt to MBUS, which was risky,
Dirt
right?
cause it was quite controversial, I'm sure.
Which in the moment, I think with any controversy, it's kind of like, but in hindsight, I think that was one of the great things about MBUS was working with her and working with other artists, which I'll show in a bit, where it was each opportunity its own way of working. Even conversations, Colette, you and I had, it was just this like really great incubator space. So this was actually a piece or a series that I was doing at Vizcaya as part of their Art Basel meets kind of FIU crossover, where they invited myself and a group of artists in the graduate program to make some site-specific works. So I was kind of challenged with thinking, okay, I have to make work in a space of Vizcaya, which had all these limitations. You couldn't pin anything to anything. You had to make work outdoors. It had to withstand some sort of natural element and really be ephemeral in that it was installed and removed within the same day or couple of days. So I thought, how does this fit into my practice? And I think that exhibition with Balaxis was this kind of predecessor of this kind of dirt being this symbol that I couldn't have planned. But in the same way, I used water and I used inkjet prints to kind of manifest or become something else. I did the same thing with imagery from Vizcaya's archive. And so like looking at their greenhouse that was destroyed from climate change, and Vizcaya is constantly being challenged with climate change and restoration and preservation. So I thought, even though this is about an estate, this has nothing to do with me personally. My family being of Cuba, even less kind of significance to when it was built or established in Miami's early history. I didn't feel connected to it. But what I did feel connected to was the way that time embeds itself. The imagery of the actual greenhouse transformed when I photographed it in water and looks like a Talbot type, looks like early photography. So there's a conversation there. When it started raining, dirt started to seep into the actual work, really transforming and changing it. Even rain, water puddling up and creating a rippling. At one point towards the end, the water had kind of puddled up so much, it tore holes in some of the prints and grass started sprouting. So that was interesting, and how my work was a response to the climate and the day of the show. Otherwise it was, I want to say, sunny. It was that one day where it just started to rain.
I think I remember that. How long was it there? How long was
It was there for a day, just one day.
Wow, okay.
So the next day for de-installation, any kind of artist is used to spackle and white paint. So this was my de-install. It was quite literally taking the prints, but even seeing the print left a grave mark or a site mark for not just kind of the square of a photograph, but for these spaces of these prints. And this is the only documentation of this, which I think, almost in the vein of like performance art, I almost wish there wasn't even documentation, even though it's great to share. Because
I think it's wonderful, yeah.
And so of course, this kind of segued to other projects I did at MBUS that both connected to my practice, but also shifted or changed. And so I was using photographs from the archive and using paint on top of it. It was my only experience probably with paint or painting, where I used white acrylic paint almost like a gesture of using white out to erase something, someone.
Well, that was image that you had taken, correct?
No, this is from my family's
Oh,
archive.
these are still family, okay.
So I'm the little boy off to the left that you can't
Okay.
make. So I did, and the only time I would take photographs in my graduate studies when I was photographing a photograph or photographing a photograph under paint or photographing a photograph under sand. Um, this is my last exhibition kind of credit in person before all of this, which was in collaboration with Mirta Gomez del Valle, who was my one of my many kind of mentors. But it was really a great exhibition in that I had students that are in my college class as an instructor at MDC. I had my high school photography teacher. I had like all these different points of time and reference in this show. And it's kind of eerie that this was the last show, but if it, and you know, if it has to be the last show I attend in person, I'm totally okay with that because it was beautiful. But in that excerpt in Mirta's show, I had a couple of works which were um, almost like fragments from different series or bodies of works. I had images like this one where I whited out the figure, but then I had images where they came from my thesis as a graduate student, which was a series called Buried Snapshots. And it played with this notion of finding these buried snapshots, these recollections, excavating, digging things up, and how time and specifically place embeds itself in what you see.
It seems like when you're working from one series to another series, that there's a nice flow to it. Is that if you're working on one series and you're having a moment like, oh, maybe this will go this way next time? Is that how it works with you in your creative process? Or is it totally different that you're just like having coffee one day and you're like, no, I'm going to start working in this? How does your creative process work?
A lot of times it almost informs itself, and it's almost like I pick up on it and I'm like, well, that's interesting. It's
Okay.
I think like almost
Yeah.
intuitive in that kind of way. But I also think I'm not reinventing the wheel. The materiality changes, but the notion is the same. Is recontextualizing or reimagining, rethinking, whether it's the past that we know of or reimagining what the past could have been. And so these, for what they're worth, it almost shows like crystallize this nostalgia, this almost scenic childhood, which other aspects of other series of works might highlight the trauma and this other element. So of course, this is something that people love. People love this series because it's approachable. It's very Miami. The photographs themselves, the imagery comes from Key Biscayne. So kind of idyllic summers on Key Biscayne amongst other turmoil. And this was part of that same curatorial practice gallery series, but this time working with Danielle Damas and seeing how different curators, different collaborators really reinterpret the work. And Colette, you mentioned some people are total control freaks and it needs to be 65 inches from the ground. I think part of collaborating and part of breaking out of this kind of institutionalized art idea is by saying, hey, here's a stack of photographs that I'm comfortable showing. Do your thing. You know, thinking of how you can engage with it in a way where it's not just always on the wall. In this case, when I worked with Danielle, we actually showed the photographs with sand in actual sand toys or objects in the gallery space. So instead of thinking of the photographs how they were previously shown, taped on the wall, you know, kind of bare, all right, let's put them in these objects that also add this context. And with the kind of poetic performance in mind, anytime anyone knocked one over, we removed the photograph. So it was like that memory, the minute it was touched by someone else, it dissipated.
So I have a really good question here, and I have a couple comments. One, they love your work. They think that's wonderful. But I also have a question here. What are your thoughts about the original photographer in the family work?
In some cases, I know who the photographer was. For this one, it was my aunt, and my aunt kind of like my surrogate mother. So I know these were from her perspective and point of view. And if I had to attribute anyone other than just like birthday party photographs or someone that I remember with the camera, it was my aunt. But other times there is no kind of clear author or clear photographer. They're anonymous. Sometimes I don't even know the subjects in some of them.
Okay.
so I thought it was only in this kind of in the spirit of time to kind of end my presentation with my first exhibition at MBUS. So I was prompted, my first exhibition there was in 2017. During Christmas break, I remember, to put on a show in MBUS's trickiest gallery space, which is the main entrance, that long hallway, using those hangers. And I was partnering up with,
It's a really, really challenging space. I give it to you for doing. I remember when I saw it, I'm like, wow, it's
yeah,
really challenging. The Lincoln Gallery, yes.
so,
The
dealing,
lighting, the chords, everything. Yeah.
right? And I think it ties itself to this Gaia too, how we're talking about site limitations and historic places, historic buildings. I believe part of the reason why we had those hanging wires were because the wall needed to be preserved as a historic space. But this work with Herman Ruiz, who was also in the graduate program, it was in conversation, and we were both thinking about place. In his term, it was specific locations and spaces, and for me, it was the erasure. I titled this specific work, the one on the left, "No Place Like Home," which ties into where we're at, so kind of crazy, and I grin because this is, call it, one of those moments where it's like, wow, the opportunity shows itself where I have to show my work. What should I show? And it seems like the context of showing this now makes me appreciate work in a whole different way than when it was first taken in 2016. I was not a fan of it. It was shown, and it's great to have your work shown and not sound cynical in that way, but I didn't feel connected to it. And it was after being kind of sheltering in place and being at home where I thought, wow, this work is becoming something else. And so with that spirit, I consider all works a work in progress, even when it's definitively, okay, this is what it's done. This is what it's done in 2020. But now in 2023, I might paint on top of it. I might burn it, shred it, or it might not reach its fruition. And I feel like that with this work, where even though I got a little bit of traction, it's really now where I can appreciate and say it does fit into my story.
Definitely, definitely. So I want to mention, so I'm glad you're showing this image on the right. There's Jacek and you and
Herman.
Herman. And the work on the right is I wanted you to talk about the scale of your work because it's hard for people to tell from your images. Like they're small. They're like Polaroids. And the ones that you showed us in the beginning of the photocopies, those are larger works, correct?
Well, all of my work is fairly small. I would want to say the majority of the work is between 4 by 6 inch to maybe 8 by 10. And then I have my kind of quote unquote larger work, which is maybe like 11 by 14. At
Okay,
sometimes like the print directly behind me, like a 24 by 36.
right.
But scale small because of the interaction or experience, the one-on-one, this uh, delicate kind of approach.
Right. I have a few comments and questions. So, one comment, everything that Jose is saying is in the work itself. His words are a whole other excellent thing. And then I have another question. Could you share some books that you are reading that are not art or theory related that fuel your work, or some books that have inspired your work?
Hmm. That's a really good question. I'm thinking in terms of when I refer to books, it's like technical books, like, darkroom alternative books. Uh, well, I guess to go back to what me and Colette were talking earlier about the pandemic and everyone picking up different traits or skills and prepping up. So something I've been interested in reading that's non-art related, but ties into my practice is reading on tarot and kind of spirituality and thinking of, like reading the cards and what does this say? And so I guess to some degree that has been what's tied in most, is not just thinking of life and death, but now spirit. Um and so perhaps that, so any kind of beginner tarot guide is what I've been reading.
Right. And when we were talking about how it's intuitive when you're reading the cards, we were talking about that. I have another comment. Wonderful work. Thank you. Very interesting. Another question. I would love to read your MFA thesis or any writing you have on memory. Mine was also on memory, but emphasizing video and film.
So my website's up. Anyone that would like to even connect further, feel free to reach out. In terms of my writing, I consider myself like a visual poet. So my writing might be part of the process, brainstorming or journaling, but it's not oftentimes where I share writing. Although whoever you are out there in the Zoom universe, reach out to me and I think we could connect and maybe have a studio visit. But I like to think of the way that I use images like the way I would write a poem. But words and specifically writing things as a thesis, more academic writing is not something that I'm a fan of from my space. I like to consume that more than maybe define it.
Another question, are you currently working on any personal projects? And I know you're getting ready for the Florida Biennial.
Yeah, so I've just been like everyone applying to tons of opportunities. In terms of my own work, I really ruminate with thoughts and some ideas. So I am working on a series of puzzles, which have been kind of in the works since I was in grad school, but never reached that. So I've been working with that, thinking about postcard exchanges amongst colleagues and friends, and and kind of just making work in this kind of space where I can almost like memory sit in front of this puzzle that has imagery, and just sit with that. And so my work has taken this kind of performative route where I even think like living at home with my grandmother and now being, one of the primary kind of caretakers, where me doing laundry, me mopping the house, me doing these kind of like in a traditional Cuban household, these like women's roles as a performance and as work. So I think the
I
most
would like to
tangible.
think that's really good that you can think of it that way.
I mean, I think so. I mean, I even have like in the back of my mind, like the man of the house is if I had to title that work, right? But that's something that's been happening or been
I like
going
that.
on. Now it's kind of glorifying or saying that, oh, this is work. And I think, you know, um, everything is work. It's the context and the way in which you think it. So hopefully there'll be some connection with a virtual gallery with the Hollywood Art and Culture Center. And hopefully at some point these puzzles will go out. The first couple times that I showed the puzzle pieces were actually at MBUS in Mirta's show. So, everything connects. It's almost like points on a map.
I love that. Well, MBUS is, John always says we're a collider for all these creative forces coming together, and I agree. So I like that idea.
Definitely. And I mean, one of my more memorable experiences, not just at MBUS, but in college in general, was when displayed my work with Belaxis. John saw the show and he said, hey, I have some tickets. If I get you tickets to see this play, will you go and see it? And he told me, I'm not going to tell you too much, but will you do it? And I was like, "Oh, okay, fine, sure." I saw the play and I cried not only because of like the content of the play, but because it really showed that he understood the work. And a lot of times when you work in an institution, it's not common that someone will, for one, appreciate and really understand the work, let alone make that gesture. So for me, I think that's what shows the special space that is MBUS.
That's great. Thank you. Yes, I agree. I agree with that. I have a question. I have a question. One of the professors is doing podcasts with her students and would want you to be on her podcast with her students.
Oh, that would be great. I mean, speaking of podcasts, another plug. I did rocking chair sessions with Maria Teresa Barbas and Elisa de Bautista,
Oh, nice.
and they have a podcast of local artists, over 100 different volumes. And I did one in early kind of quarantine with them. So
Did you go to their studio? You didn't go to their studio, right? You did it just like by Zoom or something?
We did it by Zoom at home, which again, I felt like, wow, not only am I a fan of podcasts and that podcast in particular, but also that I'm recording from home and that I didn't have the signature picture on a rocking chair. I thought was again like, well, this is so.
How are they? Yeah, I've seen that. I'm like, how are they imposing people on their rocking chair? How is that working? You'll have to tell me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's still socially distant, but it's happening. Early in the pandemic, it wasn't, and that's when I recorded.
Okay.
But
Yeah, I
now they
remember
have
the bakehouse was closed. Yeah.
yeah, they've
They
since
just
opened and I
reopened.
have my picture.
Okay. Let's see. I have another. Jose's work is very personal. I'm curious, what does he think about selling it?
Well, that's a good question. I think like many young artists or starting artists, we could conflate because of, capitalism and everything, our worth with a monetary amount. But given the kind of personal nature of my work, I haven't sold any of my work. The work that I've sold has maybe fallen in more abstract realms or formal kind of prints, but the work that I'm showing here has only been shown in galleries or museums and hasn't been sold.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have another question. Thank you for sharing your process. I've always loved your work and it's great to learn more about it.
Thank you.
I think we're out of time, but it was a really great interview. We know each other. We've met several times. I've been to your studio. I've worked with you here at MBUS, so I've always loved your work. Thank you for joining us today. And I wanted to let everyone know that we just put a survey out. If you would take a minute to take our survey, it helps us with our grants. With Miami Beach Art and Tourism Department. So I just want to say thank you very much. I'm going to unmute everyone so everybody can say hi to you. Let's see, where do I do that? Get you some virtual applause. Hold on. I may need my assistant Raymond to help me. Can you do it, Raymond? Oh,
Yes.
somebody's applauding. Oh, Tom. Hi, Tom. Hi, everyone.
Good
Good
job, Jose.
Good job, Jose.
Always a
Love
good
you.
job, Jose.
Thank you, guys.
The funniest part of this, right, is when I'm sharing screen, I don't see anyone, and now I'm seeing all these names, and it's just like not only the voices I hear, but the real ones are here. So thank you.
Yes. So it was good to have you. Great learning more about your practice. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We will be here next week with another wonderful talk. Thank you again, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Jose.
Thank you.